Some people believe that you can save money by buying a bunch of servers, hiring a team, leasing space in a data center, and running your own infrastructure. This is because these people are idiots who can't do math. Conversely, some other people believe that you can save money by finding a Seattle-based underpants merchant, paying them by the hour for servers that don't depreciate, to a vendor who never cuts prices on hourly instance costs, who nickel and dime you to death with weird pricing dimensions for steady state workloads. And the reason for this is because those people are idiots who cannot do math. It seems fair, right? That basically encompasses everyone. You people are all idiots. That's been my talk. Have a good one. That more or less seems to capture so much of the online discussions I've seen around this topic, which inspired me to build this. You have people yelling at each other about, do the math, it makes sense. No, it doesn't. And it seems to be that the assumption that other people can't do what amounts to fairly simple arithmetic with the help of Microsoft Excel, which is what makes that inexcusable. I still stick my tongue out the side of my mouth when I'm calculating a tip. Great. Honestly, distilled down, that is what the argument sounds like, where people are talking past one another, and I finally figured I'd add a little bit of nuance to it, because it's not arithmetic. And you all can do math, presumably, as well, because you're SREs, which is only true here in the Mountain View region of California. Otherwise, you're all just sparkling DevOps. I'm sure I'll hear about that one later. You can do math. I'm not doing math. This is not going to be a math-heavy talk because most people don't want to see me aggressively narrate a spreadsheet on a stage. If you do, let me know. We'll talk about a lightning talk opportunity. I'm Corey, and in my day job, when I'm not embarrassing myself in front of large audiences, I fix horrifying AWS bills for a living. Roughly half the time, that extends to contract negotiation and for large companies figuring out what they want when they renegotiate with AWS. I say this not because I'm trying to sell you on it, anyone want help with contracts, but rather because doing this requires me to have open and honest conversations with company leadership in a whole bunch of places about what they're actually doing, what their actual thought process is, what their strategic plan is. Will they be going multi-cloud? Will they be remaining with one cloud provider or dispersing out? Are you moving workloads around? Are you going back to data centers? Now, clearly, I don't get to see everything, but I am privileged in this position to be able to see more than I otherwise would working at any one place. And yes, there's going to be some selection bias as a result, but I am seeing some key themes and trends emerge. One of them, for example, is that nobody pays retail at scale. Let me make this analogy less obscure and more obvious. There we go. I can look at public cloud pricing and make almost any proposed infrastructure that really exists in public cloud look financially irresponsible or frankly ridiculous. But starting at around $1 million a year in spend, most cloud customers wind up getting discounts applied. What happens as a result then is in some cases individual services get heavily discounted. In other cases pricing dimensions start to change. Things that make absolutely zero sense mathematically when you look at it, once you see what the contract structure is, oh, that's why they're doing it that way. Okay, that's not as ridiculous as it looks. It's easy to pull up any random reference architecture and make fun of it, but that's not the reality of it. It's not about, the directions and circumstances always change. Also, because just like giraffes, cloud repatriation is not real. I know. People are talking about it a lot. You always know someone who swears they saw one once. But let's be serious here. It's not happening as a generalized overall trend. And people want to have that to point at as a big trend sweeping everything because we're starting to see the winding down of big companies migrating into cloud environments. Because there was a lot of money to be made in that transition. It's easy to make money when everything is shifting. When things hit steady state, well, that gets a little trickier, so we need to find another trend. Nobody is moving whole hog from AWS into a data center except one guy who won't stop running his mouth about it to every journalist he can possibly find because it's the only way he's relevant in 2024. Try and find me a second public example of a company doing that. I keep asking, no one's showing it. Well, they're all doing it in secret. Yeah, okay, Dropbox. In 2017, for their large workload, they did just move a 34 petabyte warehouse back to AWS a few years ago. And a lot of drivers are because it's not just the economic story then, there was a capability story. S3 at the time would not do what they wanted it to do, which is apparently, clutter up their desktop app with all kinds of irrelevant nonsense, because what they do isn't apparently what they want to do. Cool. What we do see when repatriation is real, it's small workloads that are moving back to the data center for a variety of reasons that are very rarely built around costs. No one is going whole hog, but a whole bunch of companies with something to sell you sure wish that that were true. It becomes unfortunate. What we do see is, for example, we see proofs of concept. My God, slide projectors are not doing what I want them to do. Great. What we do see is proof of concepts end up failing. We're going to go ahead and try building this in the cloud. Oh, it turns out the cloud isn't just someone else's computer. It doesn't run on those, it runs on money. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Great, so they move that workload back. That makes sense. Another example we'll see is workloads expanding to not just run in the cloud, but also in on-prem environments for a variety of reasons. And of course, the third reason that we see often is weird politics. There was a bit of this right after Parler got booted off of AWS with a bunch of companies freaking out. We're going to be next. You're a publicly traded company, not unless you're about to make a really weird pivot that I don't see coming. But people do things for mostly smart reasons. And as an aside, that giraffe has a ridiculous foot thing. You're trying to convince me those things are real? I don't buy it. Now, every single repatriation workload as well has happened at a company that already has a sizable data center footprint and knows how to run it. People are not building bespoke data centers to do these things. We'll also see people move things around when data transfer comes heavily into play, because even after discounting, it is A, impossible to understand how cloud data transfer is priced without running things through it. I built this graphic after a bunch of experimentation where the documentation fell down. And it's not just expensive, it's complicated. And the pricing is absurd compared to what you can get in data centers or from reasonable CDNs. Anything that's data egress heavy to the internet is probably not going to run that out of a cloud provider directly. They'll historically build out their own places to do that from, either in terms of Netflix's OpenConnect in-house CDN, or these days work with established CDN providers. Another reality that we see is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a very real thing. It speaks to us about prioritization. The lower we go, the more fundamental the need is. So we can continue extending that downward to the AWS bill. And yes, while it is fundamentally, increasingly more of a fundamental thing for companies, you know what's even more important and expensive to companies than the AWS bill? The people working on it. People are always going to cost more than infrastructure does, unless you're doing something truly bizarre. And people's time isn't free. For those of us who learned how to do these things by puttering around in our spare time, it's difficult to make that transition. I still forget that me working on a thing doesn't come at zero cost to the company. As a result, it rarely makes sense to migrate most workloads for economic reasons only, just because the cost of that migration is immense, not just in terms of the people time that it takes to do it, but while you're doing that, you're not doing other things. There are very few companies that could say, well, what really turned our business around was doing a migration of our workloads from one place to another. It is vanishingly rare. Focusing on something more fundamental to the business is where companies tend to see things going well. The number one most expensive line item for most companies is compensation. Number two is the cloud bill. If you start building a data center, then maybe that drops down to number three, and real estate will come back up if you also have an office. And so much of this also becomes how companies want to reflect spend, but that is significantly out of scope because, believe it or not, I'm not an accountant. I know my personality and sense of humor sometimes give that one away. So yeah, the takeaway is that cloud repatriation, as well as giraffes, aren't real. But you don't have to take my word for it. Charles Fitzgerald over at Platformonomics has been doing the Cloud Repatriation Index for a while, where he tries to calculate out, okay, the growth and spend of CapEx for the big cloud providers versus the growth of things like Equinix and hardware providers. Supermicro is the only computer manufacturer that's shown significant growth lately, and they themselves in their earnings have said that that's driven by two things. One is a bunch of work they're doing with NVIDIA to get AI computers out the door, and the second is a very large company that is almost certainly Facebook. They call themselves Meta, but you know, at some point you don't get to decide those things. And as Charles quips, okay, maybe all the cloud repatriation is serverless. It makes sense. Now, there are some hard truths that I don't think are necessarily controversial, but people don't like hearing them, so of course I'm going to inflict them upon you when it comes to where do I put workloads. The first is that cloud is probably going to be the default place going forward that most people try to build things. Because most folks who aren't, you know, out of their tree will go ahead and try it. Let's prototype this and see what happens. The rapid iteration and prototyping ability of a cloud environment is generally not going to be matched by on-prem environments until and unless you have a significant on-prem build-out and a bunch of platform work done around it. But again, this is SREcon, it is not Platform Engineering Con, which I'm sure is a year away. It's not all or nothing. At scale, every company uses everything. They always have something, name a provider, they've got something there. Most companies have some data center facilities. Oh, we don't have a data center, we just have the third floor of our building that's completely full of racks of servers, and oh, they're not always good data centers, but they are data centers. There's a reason that most of the companies who have speakers here also send speakers to hardware conferences. It's not all or nothing. Also, because I know how this goes later, for those who work at Google, let me be very clear. I can hear the rebuttal coming. Yes, if you're a hyperscaler, you are inherently building all of your stuff on-prem. Amazon is technically on-premises. They're running the environment. It is, in fact, possible to build a competing cloud environment. It just takes a few $1 billion to get started, and great. If you work at Google or Meta or Microsoft or Amazon and haven't gotten laid off yet at Amazon, great, then this doesn't apply to you. But here in the real world, we do have different concerns, because we're not quite like you yet across the board. Also, people don't believe this one, but it's true. Cost is not the primary driver when companies do things. No company sets out to build something for as little money as humanly possible and tends to get anywhere. Optimization is a following function where, okay, we've built the thing, we've made it work, now how do we make it economical? Once things are largely feature complete and serving things at a steady state, then focus can turn to optimization, which it didn't for a long time, because when money is free in a zero interest rate environment, why do you really need to care? People care about that a lot more. It's also worth pointing out that if you fear uncontrolled spend, it's a hell of a lot easier to find that happening in cloud environments. One undersung benefit of being on-prem is that there are limits. At some point, you can be irresponsible in your on-prem environment and run out of space, and now you have to buy a new rack of disks full of disks to expand your SAN. There is no forcing function that's going to make you think, oh, that's a lot of money, we should think about that. It's incrementalism. Oh, S3 is infinite storage because they can add disks faster than you can fill them. I know this because I've screwed up a loop and tried it a few times. In practice, it's just another couple cents per gigabyte month, and people don't have to stop and think about what they're really doing until one day the bill looks like a telephone number. It's also worth pointing out that as much as you want to sit there and play these games for the TCO calculators and the cloud provider websites, it's not up for debate. Long term, especially with things being amortized over ridiculous periods of time, you will spend fewer dollars out your door by going in an on-prem data center than you will by picking a cloud provider. You do need a certain point of scale for this to be true, though. If you're building something fun on top of serverless stuff or doing an experiment overnight, yeah, don't go ahead and build out an entire data center just to do those small experiments. For a while, my Lambda bill was 7 cents a month. But once it's scaled out, I mean, you folks can do basic math. Your SREs are adjacent to it. You can pull up the EC2 pricing pages and track down all the different pages upon which it's spread, and with a little bit of work, do the arithmetic yourself, and then you can pull up Dell's website, laugh, pull up Supermicro, and cut that Dell bill in half, and then do the basic analysis for yourself. And it seems even less controversial once you do that. Or why is anyone doing this? Well, it's not just raw computers. Let me give you a real-world example on this. This is a Mac Mini. Please ooh and ah and give me my Steve Jobs moment if he knew how to dress like a white Steve Harvey. Yeah, there we go. Yay, this is the Mac Mini, and everyone loses their mind. I don't have the reality distortion field in quite the same way. This is the AWS EC2 Mac Mini offering, the Mac One.metal. They stuff it into their racks and rent them out by the hour. Only one company sells Mac Minis, which makes this a very easy comparison to make. So the price is not ambiguous. If you buy a 3-year upfront savings plan, or RI, discounting is the same, the cheapest you can possibly make it per hour, you're still going to hit hardware break-even cost in month 4 out of a 36-month lease. So does that mean that it's ridiculous to use the Mac instances because they're overpriced? The answer, unhelpfully, is it depends. When enterprises are doing this and they're doing it in a way that makes sense, what you see is what they're using it for, and that is inherently Mac build boxes. Before these came out, the way that enterprises very often did builds was a Mac Mini stuffed under some developer's desk. They're vulnerable to disruption when that developer kicks the power cable by mistake, and they're usually named something like Bruno, because when the auditor comes around, you absolutely do not talk about Bruno if you want to keep your job. So in return for the cost of spending, of what it costs to run on AWS, you suddenly get to bring those Mac builds under your audit umbrella. You get to experience, things like IAM and treat them the same way rather than bespoke unicorns. You can use EBS to handle disk backups and snapshots and volume management. And you can integrate into the rest of the AWS ecosystem, which is not nothing. So for a lot of companies, yeah, it's well worth the cost. If you want to use one as your personal cloud desktop, that is economically ridiculous and you're lighting piles of money on fire. It depends on the use case. On Friday, because everything loves to cluster and I have no sense of time management, I gave a talk at scale called Terrible Ideas in Kubernetes. And I built it out of Raspberry Pi in my spare room because who knows how much a cloud provider would have charged me for that. I'm very good at predicting costs, but the data transfer, especially given how chatty Kubernetes can be, was not something I wanted to estimate. Like the control plane cost alone would have been the cost of adding an additional Pi every month. So in return for a couple of bucks in electricity, I can continue to expand the thing rather significantly. Someday I'm going to build a second one of these, and that means I will be able to pluralize it, and I will then have built 2 of them and made Kubernetes. It'll happen. For that experiment, on-prem was the right move. Now, do I do actual production work on this thing? Absolutely not. That's something relatively irresponsible, and it's not something I'd want to play with. Having to explain that to customers where their data lives, EC2 is a better answer than, oh yeah, I have the spare room, but don't worry, the lock usually works. Bad luck. It also might blow your minds, because it seems that this is a common thing that is misunderstood almost globally, but big companies generally aren't run by ignorant jackasses. When someone tells me that their environment is on-prem, I don't judge them for it. When they're all in on a cloud, I don't judge them for it. When they're spending $30 million a year on AWS managed NAT gateways, I absolutely judge them for it, but I didn't come here to inflict my political opinions upon you all. There are weird reasons backstopping all of these choices. And the constraints and the context are usually not visible externally. Corporate development, or corp dev, often tends to drive a lot of inscrutable things that they do. These are partnership agreements elsewhere in the business. You put some workloads on our cloud, or you become a reference customer for this gizmo, and then we'll have you featured in our other thing over here that benefits you. Or maybe we'll invest a few $100 million into you, and you'll feel beholden to actually spend a bunch of it over here instead of where you are. Have you seen our latest enhancements to other things now? Like, the managed NAT gateways now do IPv4 to IPv6 translation. Please use it. We accept payment in gold Krugerrands and dump trucks. Sorry, got political again. You also see all people talking about being all in on various providers. And it's not well understood, same term for, are there strategic cloud partners? But those are contractual terms of art. What that means is in return for saying they're all in or that they're a strategic cloud partner, it unlocks additional discounts and other benefits that go along with that statement. And the benefits accrue to the company. Whenever a company says wonderful things about another large company, it's a pretty good bet that there's money changing hands as a result. It does color a lot of it. So what's the right path to go down? I mean, a lot of big companies will go in either direction, cloud or on-prem, or sometimes both, and neither one is the bad choice. You can't assume that someone running a data center has never heard about the wonders of cloud before. We may not know what the decision drivers were, but you can bet that it was heavily debated. One path isn't always better than the other, although I confess I do have personal opinions sometimes about which path makes sense. Remember the early days of cloud? Maybe 2010, 2014, depending. Some of you may not, so let's fix that. Let's climb aboard the magic school bus with this walking liability nightmare of a teacher and go back to that halcyon era. If you wanted to build something on-prem that was cloud-like, the only godforsaken option you really had was OpenStack, and good luck with that. It was effectively impossible, or at least extremely difficult, for most of us to run anything that looked like it was an API-driven infrastructure. Private cloud on-prem in 2014, without ridiculous levels of investment, was a fantasy. That's not really true today in quite the same way. The market was also radically different back then. Cloud was new, it was untested, and it was untrusted as a direct result. I was at a startup in 2012, and we were doing a deal with a large bank, and they said, "Where's your data centers?" And we said, "Oh, it's in AWS. They have this great thing called EC2. And their response was, "No, really, where's your data center?" So we built data center racks out because, you know, when the money's online, you'll do a fair bit. A big part of the value proposition and sales pitch for cloud in those days was migrate to the cloud to save money. That wasn't really true, but it was a good story at the time. Own the base, rent the peak was a common phrase people would talk about because you need to scale up capacity for something. A retail company around Black Friday was a classic example. You don't want to own those things the rest of the year, rent it. And of course, every cloud provider then, as now, offers a whole bunch of credits to smooth the migration. We'll pay for the migration for you. But once you're in, what then? The governance stuff became a problem. Back then, it was relatively insurmountable. These days, it's different. Let's go ahead and return to the present, and we can return Ms. Frizzle back to jail where she belongs. So what is the better economic choice today? The answer, and perhaps unhelpfully, is that it definitely depends on you. If you're building Twitter for pets, which is, you know, just like regular Twitter, except it wasn't bought by a douchebag, great. You absolutely should not go ahead and do that on on-prem data center gear. So I would pick cloud. Well, original Twitter built in data centers, yes, in 2006. Cloud wasn't really a thing back then. It's 2024. Their constraints are not your constraints. Conversely, let's say you're a chain of hardware stores that had the temerity to be built in the 20th century before cloud was a thing, and you use technology for back office work that isn't hugely customer facing, and all your stores have to tie into it. Odds are great that unless there are serious problems with it, you should probably be on-prem with that stuff. And unless there's a massive value proposition to migrating. You've got the setup already working, and migrations are always horrifyingly expensive. So when does cloud make sense? Let's see. The first one is when you're building something new, greenfielding it. It's a great place to prototype without committing to things. The second example is when you are at a point where there isn't a whole lot of steady state. You scale up and scale down. During COVID, I ran into a lot of this. People believe firmly that they're auto-scaling, but COVID hit, 80% of their user traffic dropped off the map, and suddenly their infrastructure cost doesn't change at all. It's like so flat that you could go bowling on it. And of course, in many cases, if you need something complicated, so many clouds build-outs are just a pile of VMs that are fundamentally there to make the data center environment better at the expense of the cloud. What is true then, and has been true now, and will remain true for the future, is that cloud is not an economic cost-saving story, it's a capability story. So if you're not using those capabilities, well, maybe that changes things up a bit. So what workloads make sense? If you already have a data center, yeah, particularly as some other workloads vacate that data center as they go to cloud, freeing up capacity, it changes the equation somewhat. It's possible as well that you've got a whole bunch of workloads that are just steady state VMs, which, let's face it, is kind of what a lot of cloud workloads still look like. They lift and then forget to shift. And of course, it comes down to staff training as well. I have a friend who runs a company. They serve cloud companies as well as on-premise companies, but all the stuff they have built for a variety of reasons is in data centers. He flags it out as being harder to hire as a result because people want to work with cloud technologies more so than they want to scrape their knuckles to bits with rack nuts trying to get them in and out of the rack. People wincing and chuckling at that, you're my people. You know where we've been. Now, of course, there is an economic caveat to this. Remember back when we were all young and some of us who didn't have money would pirate VMware so that we could run it? Yeah, it turns out now that we're all grown up, the pirates bought VMware. So if your VMware bill is about to be 10 times what it was last renewal, then suddenly, okay, maybe the economics of this are a little bit different. I was talking to one company that was staring down a 12x increase. 6 to 8 is fairly common, and there are a number of case studies on 10x in the past 100 days. But sure, that's going to go well. So, what have we learned today? We've learned that it depends, and we don't necessarily know enough to judge from the outside. We've learned that people inherently cost more than computers do, because that's right, go and get that bag. I'm a big fan of paying people more. We should not necessarily trust the tech press because the people who pitch repatriation stories have something to sell them, and love my tech press friends though I do, they're not necessarily in the best position to judge whether this is real or a sales pitch. I still don't understand how in the world Ms. Frizzle was ever allowed around children. And there is no right answer to a lot of these things. Also, political opinion comes back. Giraffes aren't real, because that's important. Now, there is one caveat, though. And that is that with this world of Gen AI, where everyone is trying desperately to get their hands on NVIDIA GPUs, right now they're going to go wherever they can get them. Whether that turns into something lasting and turns established wisdom square on its head, that could be fascinating, or maybe not. Just as soon as someone other than NVIDIA finds a business model that can sustain the trillions of dollars being thrown into it, maybe that will shift. I'm Corey Quinn. This has been Scam or Savings and Cloud versus On-Prem Economic Slapfight, and I have now successfully won a bar bet that I could give a talk with the word Slapfight in the title. Thank you very much for listening to me yammer.